Hey everybody, welcome to the Underwater Photography Show. I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And I'm going to start this one with a little story time. So as people watching this may know, I guide and do a little bit of underwater photography teaching at Blue Heron Bridge in Florida, where I live, or near where I live. And one of the things that I get asked about a lot when people want to come dive is they want to try this in terms of shooting underwater. And my response is always, why don't we focus on one thing, shoot on a particular dive? And the way I will always frame this is, if you try to shoot everything everywhere all at once, you're going to end up coming back from that dive with a whole bunch of mediocre pictures that you're not really happy with. Whereas if you focus on one particular type of picture, you can come back with maybe 4 or 5 really, really nice ones. And you won't have a million pictures, but you'll have a few that you're really happy with. And I think we're going to talk about that today, like the aspect of focusing your attention as you develop as an underwater photographer on going on dives with a purpose versus just kind of going in there willy-nilly and aiming to photograph every single thing you see, because it's a recipe for a bunch of poor pictures.
Yeah, and I think the more you optimize, refine, focus your approach and your gear, the closer you get to creating those standout shots. So, if there is a recipe to creating really special underwater photos, it's to go away from that generalist, I want to do everything all at once, all at the same time, as you were saying, and go down this line of a more specialist approach. Now, I wrote an article about this. I wrote a monthly column for a British magazine called Scuba Diver, which also has co-editions all around the world. And I know the column is reproduced in all of those as well. And I actually wrote about this as a sort of a general comment. And I was just going to read a little bit of that article, just because I could waffle on for 10 minutes, or I could read an article for 1 minute with all the same content in. Photographic perfection is an impossibility, but striving for it is an essential for standout images. Most of us take up underwater photography to capture a record of what we've been seeing on our dives. The shots allow us to relive those moments and share them with others. When we're starting out, our goal is simply a clear image of every cool thing we encounter. Ideally, we want a camera system that can collect pictures of as many different sizes of subject as possible. As our portfolio grows, however, our mindset shifts. Some things are easier to type than say. From being a diver with a camera to a photographer who dives. Now our aim becomes producing the best photos we can when we're underwater, which means ignoring much of what we see and thoroughly working the most photogenic opportunities, typically dividing dives into macro and wide angle. This is the first step in optimizing our approach and striving towards perfection. But we're not yet at our destination. As we develop, we subdivide and optimize further and further, trying ever closer to edge towards that perfection. One of the toughest hurdles as our photography standards balloon is learning what gear to leave up on the boat. I think it's Snell's second law that the longer an underwater photographer stays involved in the hobby, the more photographic gadgets they accumulate. And learning what not to take in is particularly difficult because those accessories are never cheap. Having researched, bought and brought a shiny new item all this way, it's inevitable that we want to get our value from it on every dive. But dressing our camera system up like a Christmas tree is counterproductive. Decked out gear is harder to shoot, and overly bulky systems cannot be squeezed into the perfect position for the killer composition. Furthermore, a photographer cluttered with options is less likely to think clearly about a shot, more likely to be distracted by the next toy, unlikely to push on for that standout image. And then the article kind of goes into its main meat. But as an intro section, I think that covers quite a lot of those opening points, that if you want great images, think about what you want before the dive and optimize for them. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be aware of great possibilities. But I think when you get everything set beforehand, your mindset is in a certain area and you're looking for a specific type of subject in a specific spot that you know is like, and what I mean a specific spot, I mean kind of, it's about finding great subjects in a position that's going to allow you to produce a great image from them. So, they're posing in the right way. There's the right background possibilities around them. I think that is really the goal to it. And I think, the more you shoot, the more you realize you can't force these opportunities, and you have to, you become a very relaxed underwater photographer. I know I am. I'll take the opportunities when they're there. I'll work them hard when they're there. But when they're not there, I'm kind of quite chilled out about life and, waiting for those chances. I don't know if you want
Yeah,
to come back on that, Matt, at all.
well, I was going to say that I find myself, and I've gotten to the point now where I am pretty good with being like, all right, I'm going to take this on this dive. This is the kind of shot I'm going for. If it means I miss other opportunities, so be it. But before I got to that point, and you, like you said, you bring everything you own on a dive, you end up stressing about all of it, and then you're not enjoying the dive, and you're not making good pictures. So then you come up, and it's just you've just kind of wasted a dive essentially. And one thing that really hit home that you said is when I first started out taking pictures, it was just about I'm going to get a clear picture of an animal and make sure it's in the frame. That's all I needed to do. But then you try to take pictures of literally everything you see. So you come back with a bunch of, looking back now, really mediocre images. And I think what you said is really apt. You start out as a diver with a camera or something like you start out with a diver. However you said it was much more eloquent than I'm going to remember it, but you become a photographer who's also a diver or something like that.
Mm.
And that's the point that I think a lot of people eventually progress to if they care about the actual photography of it. And a lot of people don't. They just want to take pictures of
The
everything
cool
they
stuff
see.
they
And
saw,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I think if you care about the photography side, you kind of have to break yourself
Mm.
out of that at some point, and really, focus on the images more than necessarily what you're seeing.
Mm.
And which is hard, especially if you're traveling to Lembe, you want to see Wonderpuss and Harry Frogfish and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean you should overlook, a cool ghost pipefish or something like that that's in a really photogenic position, or a common shrimp that's in a really photogenic position, because those will often be the best images, even if they're not necessarily the coolest
Mm.
subject.
And I think these
And
are actually difficult skills for people to learn in underwater photography.
yeah,
It's relatively easy to learn how to do your lighting, how to do your aperture, how to do your shutter speed. But actually, it's how you behave as an underwater photographer, how you approach things, how you see the potential in possibilities that I think in many ways are the harder skills to learn in underwater photography, and the ones that people don't focus on. They're so focused on, I want this gadget and I want this technique.
yeah,
Well, you're talking about Lembe. I routinely, when I dive in Lembe, I'm going there running workshops. My camera is always the smallest, simplest on the boat. Everyone else
yeah,
has got, their two strobes and a snoot and a focus light and a flip diopter and colored, a torch in their pocket with a bunch of colored things on it. And I've always got the simplest camera. Often it'll be just a camera with a single strobe on it. But
yeah,
my feeling is, that cluttered camera it shows a cluttered mind, and I'm always giving people a hard time about it, and they all ignore me on the workshops, and they want to take all their gadgets down with them, and I will use all those gadgets during the trip, but this dive I'm going all in on snoot shots. I'm going to take the strobe down with the snoot on, and I'm just going to really focus on doing those shots as well as I can for this dive. And yeah, if I see something truly amazing, I might take the snoot off and take a more standard shot, if that's what that subject needs. But ultimately, I'll try and get an amazing shot of it with the snoot.
yeah.
And the same with all the other accessories. But I prefer that much more focused approach, and I think it's key to getting that higher standard of imagery.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult skill to learn.
And I don't claim to be a world class shooter, but in terms of my photography, it has certainly improved since I have gone in the water simplifying everything and not trying to bring all of my gear constantly.
Mm.
Um, and that's when, like, for example, whenever if somebody comes, I'll go back to the bridge. Somebody's like, I want to do snooting and shallow depth of field and whatever else, and they have one dive. And I was like, I understand you want to figure all that stuff out, but we're gonna have to pick one of those, and we can hammer that for the entire dive, and then you'll be good to go with that one. And then if you come back again, we can do something else. And inevitably, that ends up being far more productive than
Mm.
trying to find something to snoot, something to do shallow depth of field with, something to do this with, because oftentimes your subject is not conducive to all of those. So then you have to try to go find all of these different things,
Yeah.
and end up wasting a lot of time on the dive instead of just trying to focus on a particular skill.
And if you have that focus, you're just out there scanning for the
Yep.
opportunity that's going to suit that, and as a result, you get those special shots.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think comes up quite a lot in this is, okay, if your camera rig is really, really focused on one particular thing and therefore is very inflexible, is the solution to dive with two cameras or multiple cameras? And I would argue that, well, I would argue very simply no. I think that in the days of film, there was strong motivation for having multiple cameras. And that was because, there were cameras that took 36 pictures, there were cameras that took 12 pictures, even 8 pictures, depending on the cameras. And of course, that's a lot of very few photography opportunities for, 60 plus minutes of diving or however long you're in the water for. And it made sense for photographers to take multiple cameras because you could, and I think a lot of the photographers who took multiple cameras at that time would quite simply shoot 20 minutes of wide angle and then, right, I've done my wide angle. Now I'm, I spotted a few macro things while I was going around. I'll now go back over there and shoot my macro and that sort of thing. But ultimately, they were doing what we can now do on digital in terms of number of frames in the pictures. And I think, the reason why a lot of the best photographers in that era were shooting multiple camera systems is they were ultimately harnessing one of the major advantages of a digital camera in the film era. And that
Yeah.
just the amount of exposures they were shooting was giving them fantastic opportunities for that. Um, the next the other thing that I would say about two cameras is though that in the digital era you can dive with two cameras. I have done it a reasonable number of times. And I do it to some degree when I dive with my wife, and we quite often dive, one of us with one setup, my wide angle, one with macro, and we'll switch over on them on certain subjects. But I would say that having two cameras makes me way less than half as productive with each one. So if I have one
Yeah.
camera set up for one job, and I say take 100 good shots with that camera, if I had two cameras on that dive, I would expect to take way less than 50 good shots with either. So ultimately, over the course of a week, my productivity is way lower by diving with two cameras. Now, there's no doubt that there are times when you go on a macro dive in Lembe and it's just, there's lovely blue water in the strait, the sun is coming down, and you're like, wow, there is a couple of stunning wide angle shots on this dive. And if I could have a wide angle camera for 5 minutes, I'd get some amazing shots and then I'd quite happily give it up. And yes, that's fine. Before the EMWL, I used to do my wide angle macro by diving in Lembe with a secondary Micro Four Thirds camera with a mini dome on it, and I'd do my wide angle macro with that. And I used to give that to the dive guide and almost just forget about it until the time. And I think in those situations, the second camera can work quite well. But I think
Yeah.
you operate much better by basically if you are doing the two camera thing, it's a case of, right, I have a primary camera and the other camera is there for the one or two shots in the whole dive. The rest of the dive, I'm fully on this. I'm doing this. I'm doing this. Oh wow, there's the one subject I was waiting for macro, or there's the one bit of the reef that's particularly good for wide angle. I'll change to the second camera, do the shots with that, and go out. But I think you only get that reward if your skills are to the level where you can switch backs and forwards very easily.
Yeah.
With the amount of photography I've done, I've always been very good at making those switches. I can be in the middle of a wide angle trip and I can just jump straight in and shoot super macro. Fine, because I've done it so many times. But I see time and again with my guests, if they're in the middle of a Raja Rampat wide angle trip and then suddenly they're like, oh, I want to do pygmies. And they'll really find it hard because they just aren't used to doing the super macro in the middle of the trip. Whereas I often say, oh, if you want to do pygmies, how about you do a normal macro dive, first dive of the day, and then second dive, wind it up into super macro for your
Yeah.
pygmies, just to get yourself back in the zone rather than getting in front of a great subject and basically blowing the opportunity because you were still in wide angle headspace.
I would think it's also important to note that if you're going to do the whole two camera thing, it's probably easiest to do at a place that you're very familiar with. Because then you kind of have an idea of what the possibilities are. Like the only place I would consider taking two cameras would be, for me, would be Blue Heron because I've done 600 plus dives there. So I know it well.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of place where I can put a camera down, swim away from it for a reasonable distance. And as long as it's in, and it's just on the sand, and as long as it's in my field of view, I'm not worried about it. If you're diving a wall in Raja Ampat, it's way harder to have a second camera rig along.
Mm.
Even if you have it strapped to yourself somehow, it's going to probably be getting in the way or bouncing or dangling or something like that. So I think that's important to note, that if you are going to do a two camera thing, it's probably best at a site you're really familiar with, and that you don't necessarily have to be carrying both the entire time. You can put one down, do something, pick it up, swim somewhere else, put it down, do something, and still understanding that chances are you either won't use that second camera, or if you do, you're going to end up with some half baked pictures, because you were focused on a different style of image on that dive.
In
Where
the,
and you brought up the film case. I can understand that. Although I don't really shoot too many pictures, I think I'd probably be okay with 36 pictures on a on a dive and not having a second rig. Um, but that's 37th is when you'd really nail it if you had that extra frame. So
Yeah, and
who
when you
you
know
film?
36 is the limit, then once it goes past 30, you feel the pressure of running out of
Yeah,
frames. So, but yeah, I think it's the thing that used to happen a lot in the film era is people would follow what you did at Blue Heron of taking two cameras in, leaving one on the sand. But they would be doing it at dive sites they weren't so familiar with. So it was very common that cameras would be lost. And we would come up from a
yeah,
dive. Oh, we've got to dive that site again because I couldn't find my camera at the end of the dive. I think someone's taken it. And it was always, well, in my experience, it was always the case. No one had taken it. It was just the person got confused as to where they were on the site. And they were
yeah,
like,
yeah,
I'm sure this is the place I put it down. And actually, they're like completely the other end of the site, having got turned around during the dive.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's if you are going to start leaving cameras around, make sure you're one of those divers that has a sense of direction rather than the vast majority who seem to have no sense of direction
Yeah.
underwater.
Yeah, Ariana would say that she has an awful sense of direction underwater. So if she were to put something down, it's never getting refound. So she would not be. I would not have her put a camera down. I have a decent sense underwater, but
Yeah.
even then, I would still prefer to it be at a place that I'm familiar with.
So I would
Um,
say the risky ones are the ones that don't acknowledge they don't have a good sense of direction.
yeah, yes, of course,
So
of course.
yeah, so no,
Yeah,
but my general advice is think very carefully about the two camera thing. I know it's not something that people are going to do on a whim because of the costs involved, but every now and again you find actually, you're diving with your buddy, they're not going to do this dive. You're like, should I go wide angle? Should I go macro? They're like, why don't you take my rig down as a second camera?
yeah,
And I think, just be very wary of how unproductive it can be. I think you just
yeah,
spend your whole time trying to find both types of shot and end up finding far less to shoot. Whereas
yeah,
if you went in with that focus on wide angle, you'd be just like in the zone. There's a shot. There's a shot. There's a shot. Whereas I think when you have both on, you often don't see the shots as well because you're regressing back to that stage of being a diver looking for cool stuff, and anything cool is worthy of a shot rather than
yeah,
being a focused photographer with a uncluttered housing and uncluttered mind looking for those special images. And I
yeah.
think
And that ties
that's
out,
what, yeah.
yeah, that ties into the beginning again as well. With regardless of the set the two camera thing aside, but just having going into the water with a particular focus and not trying to shoot all of it
Mm,
on a single dive, because then you'll come back with a whole bunch of pictures that you're not really happy with versus maybe 4 or 5 that you really really like,
yeah.
or 1 or 2. But even that is, I consider that a great dive. You come up with 1 or 2 pictures, but again, I'd shoot far less than the average person on a dive. So your mileage may vary, but I think this is an important topic because it's something that I get asked about a lot, and I'm sure you do too, Alex. So
Yeah, and it's
hopefully,
a difficult skill to learn. It's why,
yeah,
it's not something you can just flick a switch and suddenly be doing it. You need to go out with that attitude. But if you go out with that attitude, that the experience will build and it'll become part of the way you approach things. And it's one of those important steps that takes you from being a decent underwater photographer to producing really special shots.
yeah. So hopefully this was useful to people. And as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for the support. Leave any thoughts or comments in the comment section below. And we will see you guys in the next episode of the Underwater Photography Show.